To keep this conversation going, please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments.
All right. Thanks, Kathy. Um, Thanks everybody for having me. It's really nice to be with you. Uh, a long way away in distance, but very close in terms of the movement that we're all part of. Uh, so I'll just get straight into this, and there's quite a lot here, but I will go fairly quickly to make sure we've got time for a conversation at the end. Um, First of all, why did I call this book Five Times Faster? Well, it's a phrase that I found myself saying quite a lot when we were hosting the COP26 climate change conference, and I was having calls every day with people from other countries. And I was saying, look, over the past 2 decades, on average, the global economy has decarbonized at a rate of about 1.5% per year. That's in terms of emissions per unit GDP. So maybe surprisingly, it has been going down, but very slowly. But if we're going to meet the target of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, then that rate of reduction needs to be more like 8% a year. And that's a 5 times faster difference. And what I was saying to people was that kind of acceleration must require doing something differently. It can't be doing the same, but just trying harder. It must be something very different. And maybe it also requires thinking about the problem differently. Maybe just in the way that if you want to change the visible infrastructure of the buses and the factories and the coal plants, then you have to also change the underground invisible infrastructure of wires and pipelines and sewers. Maybe if we want to change the policy and the outcomes that we see in the economy, we also need to change some of the invisible infrastructure of ideas and institutions. So that's what the book is about. That's what this talk is about. And I split this in science, economics, and diplomacy, three fields where I think some of the ideas need to change. I'll be briefest on the science because I think we want to talk mostly about the solutions. I expect we have a shared feeling about the problems. It might seem very strange to suggest that rethinking of climate science is needed. Normally, that's the kind of thing you might hear from climate deniers who don't have anybody's best interests at heart. Um, but I actually think what we need for policymakers, especially at the top of government, but also for society, is a proper risk assessment. And often the information that's given up to the top levels of government is not a risk assessment. It's in the form of prediction. Uh, there's a big difference between those two things. Prediction tends to say first, what do we think is most likely to happen? And then it might second ask, how does that affect things that we care about? Risk assessment asks those questions the opposite way around. It says, first, what do we care about? And what's the worst that could happen in relation to those interests? And then second, it asks, how likely is that? Now, to illustrate what's the difference for that in terms of a climate change example, well, a bit like the apocryphal frog in the pot of boiling water, we might be told it's going to get warmer over the coming decades, and as a result of that, labor productivity is going to decrease by 10%, 20%, whatever. You get quite a lot of these kind of predictions. And okay, yeah, that's not a good thing. We all like it if labor productivity goes up. Going down doesn't sound great, but it also sounds kind of manageable. Nobody hears that and thinks, oh shit, from now on, this is the thing I'm going to work on. This is the biggest problem there is. What if instead of that, you say, well, what's the worst that can happen as the world gets hotter? Well, in fact, you can have combinations of heat and humidity that exceed the human body's limit of tolerance. You can't sweat it out, that extra heat. You could be lying down in the shade, tipping water over yourself to try and keep cold, and still die of heat stress. And by the way, also be young and healthy until you die of heat stress. Uh, so that's a really extreme limit. That's the sort of worst case scenario for this particular climate risk. Then you ask, how likely is that? And the answer is, in the current climate, zero probability. But once you get to warming of around 4 degrees, suddenly it starts becoming extremely likely very quickly. And this is in very highly populated parts of the world, northern India, southeast China, southeast USA, where hundreds of millions of people live. So this is the way that we need to understand climate change information. That applies to these socioeconomic risks, like lots of people dying, and it also applies to the physical changes in the climate itself. Understand what are the worst things that could happen to the climate, to the Earth system, while they're passing tipping points. How likely is that? The probability really rapidly increases as warming increases. And one of the most dangerous things is the fact that all of these tipping points are connected to each other. So there are about half a dozen of them that could be passed somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming. And each one that we pass increases the likelihood of passing others. So uh, that's as much as I want to say about the risk. But it's not just to convey the idea that, okay, we're in a bad situation. And it's not even just to say we need to think differently about how we process this scientific information and present it in a more useful way to governments and society. It's also to say that there are some similarities between the way we understand the climate and the way that we need to understand the economy. So, economics. For about the last 150 years, the dominant form of economic thinking has imagined the economy as a system in equilibrium. And this is defined as a situation in which nobody has an immediate reason to change their actions so that the status quo can continue, at least temporarily. There's various other definitions as well, but that's the most fundamental one. And if you read the IPCC's report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, then it says this is a challenge of system transitions, not rapid and far-reaching system transitions, unprecedented in terms of scale. A system transition is where you move from one technology or family of technologies to another completely different one. And as you do so, you also change the social constructs around those technologies, the patterns of production and consumption, the governance of them, the infrastructure, the institutions, and everything. So system transition is a big deal in the part of the economy where it happens. So you could say it's a situation in which everybody has every reason to change their actions so that the status quo is replaced with something completely different. In other words, it's about as far from equilibrium as you can get. So I know this is a very theoretical starting point, but I promise this is going to get practical very quickly. Just one more step before it does get practical. What does that mean we think the economy is like? If you think it's a system in equilibrium, then you are imagining it like a machine. You think it's static. It might have some moving parts, but the parts themselves don't change, and the relationships between them don't change. It's got limited future possibilities. So if you know its current state, you can probably predict what it's going to do in future. And what's the role of policy in this machine economy? Well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But of course, just fix it when it fails. And then do the minimum to put it right. Don't mess around with it. But what if the economy is not like that? What if it's not in equilibrium? What if it's, in fact, most of the time, a disequilibrium system? Well, then it's not static. It's constantly changing. It's evolving. It has an unlimited range of future possibilities. You can't even list them, let alone put probabilities on them. So it's fundamentally uncertain. And in fact, it doesn't either function or fail. So you can't say do nothing and just fix it when it fails. There is no failure. There are just different directions that it can evolve in. Some might be better, some might be less good for society's objectives, whatever we decide they are. So the role of policy in that kind of economy is to steer its evolution in a desired direction. Now, where did this idea of the equilibrium economy come from? Well, I don't want to spend too much time on that in this talk, but basically it came because economists at that time thought it'd be really nice if economics looked like a science, and science had equations where you could solve it and get an answer, and they wanted that for economics too. So that's what they did. They assumed something that made it easy to solve equations and get an answer. That doesn't mean that's how the economy actually works. If you actually look at how it works, then it depends about the time scale and the spatial scale that you're interested in, but much of the time it's acting like a disequilibrium system. In fact, the equilibrium is the special case. The general case is disequilibrium, constant change, uncertainty, and evolution. So let's go on to why does that matter and how does it affect how we think about policy on climate change? Well, this isn't normally part of my slide pack, but I put it in for this talk because I thought, where have I heard about citizens' climate lobby before? I have heard about them in connection with James Hansen. And when I was first getting into climate change, before I worked on it at all, I read a load of books because I was just getting interested. This was one of the ones I read, one of the very best, and it made a big impact on my thinking. And one of the things that stuck in my mind was what James Hansen said about carbon pricing. He compared these two options. He started by saying, of course, economists are almost unanimous that carbon pricing is the best way of approaching climate change. So let's consider the different ways of doing it. And he argued that cap and trade was fairly useless and that a fee and dividend was much better. And the reason why he framed in terms of feedbacks. Cap and trade sets a floor in emissions. So if emissions go down, the price crashes. It makes fossil fuels cheaper effectively, making it more economical to burn fossil fuels. That's a balancing feedback or a dampening one. It holds back change. Any progress you make, it makes you less likely to make more progress. And then he said, in contrast, the fee and dividend approach has no floor. Your actions might spur your neighbor to do more. In other words, you reduce emissions, you're reducing everybody else's dividend while the fee stays the same. So you've created a reinforcing feedback, an amplifying feedback. Anything that one person does encourages other people to do more. Amplifying feedback accelerates change in the direction that you're trying to go. And I thought that's a really good point. That's a very fundamental difference. I still do. The thing that surprised me when I first spoke to climate change economists about it was they didn't agree. They thought that these two different modes were fundamentally equivalent, that as long as they were on average the same level, they would achieve exactly the same thing. I thought that was very strange, and it took me several years to fully understand why. But I won't leave you hanging. It's because they don't think in terms of feedbacks. In equilibrium systems, feedbacks are not really part of the language. You can have balancing ones because balancing feedbacks can keep you in a state of equilibrium. You can't really deal very well with reinforcing feedbacks. So there are words for them. I'm not saying there's no place for these in economics, but economists don't talk to each other in the language of feedbacks. And so I was very happy when I eventually came across this study by a Dutch academic, Emil Chapin, who used an agent-based model, a dynamic model, a model that doesn't force its system into a state of equilibrium, but instead experiments, it simulates a changing system. And he tested out these two policies, and look what he found. Same average carbon price over the course of the simulation, but the carbon tax gets much faster emissions reduction than the cap and trade. And not only that, if you look at his other graphs, the carbon tax does it with a lower price of electricity. He's simulating change in the power sector. And it also achieves a greater technological shift than the cap and trade. So it's better in three ways. And these are not just about details of implementation as the standard mainstream economic belief would expect. These are fundamental differences in what I would call the dynamic efficiency of the two policy options. The one with the reinforcing feedback is much better than the one with the balancing feedback. But I want to go a bit broader in the range of policy options because, of course, James Hansen was a scientist and his expertise was in the climate science. And when he looked at the policy, then, of course, he listened to all the economists and he heard this kind of thing. Managing Director of the IMF, President of the European Commission, Director General of the World Trade Organization, or equally authoritative people a decade or so before. And they're all saying carbon pricing is the most cost-efficient solution to achieve climate goals. And of course, there's another guest appearance on this slide from somebody that somebody might know who used to run a bank in London. And this is what they're all saying. What if they're wrong? I actually think they are all wrong. I'm a supporter of carbon pricing, especially if it's a tax, and even more if it's a tax and dividend. I think that's a great policy. But it's not necessarily the best one in all situations. And I'm quoting here Stefan Hallegatte, who is now the chief climate change economist at the World Bank. He wasn't in such a senior position when he wrote this, um, but he was pointing out that all the progress we've made so far has been made fundamentally with policies that directed investment at the new technologies, the clean technologies. And the best example of that of all is solar power. Back in 2005, governments were aiming to deploy 50 gigawatts of solar power by 2020. And that's what analysts like the International Energy Agency thought that they could manage. When they actually got to 2020, then collectively they deployed over 700 gigawatts of solar power, more than 10 times as much, more than 12 times as much as they'd expected 15 years before. So did they do the second best thing and just get incredibly lucky? Or did they actually do the right thing? I think they did the right thing. They picked the right policies. And this is why it's one of those amplifying feedbacks, in fact, more than one, uh, that James Hansen was talking about that are so helpful to you. These are your friend. You want amplifying feedbacks if you're trying to achieve structural change. And early in the in the early in the transition, when you're developing and deploying a new technology, if you're lucky, if it's the right kind of technology, then it can benefit strongly from these kind of reinforcing feedbacks. The learning by doing, the more you make it, the better it gets. The economies of scale, the more you make it, the cheaper it gets. The emergence of complementary technologies, other ones that come along and make the first one more useful. Like batteries come along, they make solar and wind power more useful. That's a complementary technology. And this mega feedback between investment leading to more innovation, which makes it better and cheaper, increases demand. Increased demand leads to more investment. This is what we're seeing. This is why the cost of solar PV has come down by a factor of 10,000 in the last 50 or 60 years. So it's gone from being something so expensive you would only have it on a satellite to being the source of the cheapest electricity in history. So cheap that people in Pakistan imported more solar panels than their entire national grid capacity over the space of 6 years without the government asking them to or encouraging them to, just because that was cheaper than relying on their coal-dominated national grid. That is how cheap solar is becoming now. And it's all thanks to these feedbacks and the policies that activate these feedbacks early in the transition when the new technology is expensive are the targeted subsidies that get it deployed. You can think about this just in a different context. If we just take ourselves out of the mindset of climate change and the language that we're used to, and just think about technology transitions that happened in the past. How did they happen? And I know this is a bit facetious, but you think about the transition from horses to cars, and it happened because people invented motors, they built cars, they built factories, they invested in the highways, they wrote the highway code. It didn't happen because they put a tax on horse shit. So you can think about anything else, the internet didn't happen because we taxed letter writing. You have to create the new before you break the old. And there's a great Chinese phrase for this. The English for it is first build, then break. And that's the principle they're applying. That's probably why they're dominating the world in all of the clean technologies, because they've understood this logic. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about each of the three main levers of policy. So that first one was all about investment, targeted subsidies, incredibly useful, especially early in the transition, very dynamically efficient because of all those reinforcing feedbacks. The second lever of policy is regulation. And regulation is so often talked about in negative terms by policymakers. It's always called burdensome or it's called red tape. Let's cut the red tape. And it's always assumed that regulation adds cost. But what if it doesn't? What if the opposite can be true? This is my favorite example of something showing the positive effect of regulation. And if you look very carefully at the small print in the reference citation there, the last name is S. Chu. That is Stephen Chu, Nobel Prize winning physicist and previously Energy Secretary to Barack Obama. And the reason he took time off from being Energy Secretary and a Nobel Prize-winning physicist to write his first ever paper on economics was he was getting really annoyed with the economists in his Department of Energy who kept saying, yeah, we know that you would like to adopt really strict efficiency standards for things like fridges and air conditioning and washing machines. But if you do that, it's going to push up the price of these appliances. Why would it do that? Well, it must do, because that's the only way that you can maintain equilibrium. And he thought, what if this is wrong? He looked back at the data and he found the opposite, that at points in the past when tough efficiency standards have been introduced, they accelerated price decline. Why would they do that? Well, the economy is an evolving system. Change, I think, happens according to the processes of evolution. And the rate of evolution of a population is inversely proportional to its fitness for its current environment. In other words, if you're really safe and very successful, you don't need to evolve very fast. If you're under threat, you need to change quickly. Necessity is the mother of invention and all that. And so what you're doing when you regulate, you're changing the fitness function for this part of the economy. You're changing what it means to be successful. And you're saying, sorry, inefficient fridges, you're no longer fit for your environment. You're going to suffer unless you evolve very quickly. So then you're forcing the companies in that part of the economy to allocate more of their resources to their R&D budgets instead of their advertising budgets. You're forcing them to innovate faster. That's why this can happen. So regulation can reallocate finance, it can force innovation, and it can accelerate cost reduction. So in the context we're in, those are incredibly useful effects. And you don't have to spend loads of money every time as the government. You can just use a good old regulation and make something different happen. I think, does Canada still have a ZEV mandate? I hope it does. The UK does, where it's always under fire. A zero emission vehicle mandate is a wonderful policy tool, forces car makers to reallocate their investment from the petrol cars to the zero emission vehicles, the electric cars. What happens when they do that? Well, you get economies of scale, you get learning by doing, you get faster cost reduction. So this is from a model, not from real life, but it tallies quite well with what we're seeing in real life, that the places where they have implemented ZEV mandates, they're getting very rapid diffusion, and that diffusion also helps to drive rapid cost reduction. So now I want to come on to tax. And we already talked a little bit about the choice of tax instrument. But here I want to talk about the level. How high should a tax be? How high should a carbon price be? Well, the standard economics view, based on the equilibrium thinking, is that it should reflect the social cost of carbon. It should internalize the externality. Why would it do that? Well, it just levels things. It means that you reduce emissions to the point that it's worth reducing them to balance that with the dangers of climate change. So you get things back into equilibrium. That's the idea. And driven by that understanding, the White House Council of Economic Advisors has put out these kind of statements saying, well, we've updated our understanding using the best science available, done our evaluation of costs and benefits, and we've revised our estimate of the social cost of carbon from $36 a ton of CO2 to $37 a ton of CO2. That came out in November 2013, as it says. At exactly the same time, what was the best available science actually saying? Well, it was saying that you really have to come up with a value representing willingness to pay to avoid human extinction. Given that you can't entirely rule that out, you need to come up with a value for it. And without doing so, your estimates of the social cost of carbon can be unboundedly high. In other words, it's somewhere between naught and infinity. Now, as a policymaker, I don't find that an incredibly helpful guide to policy. Set the level somewhere between naught and infinity. I'd like to narrow it down a bit more than that if I can. So what do? I also don't really trust this $37 a ton. Where's it come from? I think there's a completely different and actually really obvious way of thinking about this, which is the absolute cost is irrelevant. There's actually no such thing as absolute value in the economy. We make it up. Uh, Money is just a way of keeping score. It's not a physical or a biological quantity. There is no absolute value. There's only relative value. When does one thing cost more than another? That's how value becomes reality because it affects the behavior of people or companies or investors. So we should think in terms of relative value, and that quickly takes you to thinking about tipping points. How can you use tax to make one thing more expensive than another thing? And when I first started looking at this, in fact, I teamed up with Tim Lenton, who's written a lot about tipping points in the climate, and he was thinking, might there be some good tipping points in the economy, positive tipping points? And we found two examples, and they both corresponded with the fastest transitions in the world in their respective sectors. The UK had used a fixed carbon tax in the power sector, which combined with the cap and trade system, which wasn't doing very much at all, to be honest. But the fixed carbon tax helped make coal more expensive than gas. And that was at a point where both of them were fighting over a shrinking share of the market as renewables were expanding. And that kicked out coal from our system. We've got rid of it altogether now. There's none left. And that resulted in a power sector decarbonisation that was about 8 times faster than the global average over the course of a decade. So we're looking for a 5 times faster acceleration. That got 8 times faster. That's pretty useful. The other example was Norway and road transport, where they did this very deliberately. I should have said, I think the UK did it by accident. Norway did it deliberately, and they used a purchase subsidy for electric vehicles and a tax on the sale of petrol cars so that an electric vehicle was cheaper at the point of purchase than a petrol car, an equivalent one, not just over its lifetime, but at the point of purchase. And when I made this graph in, I think it was 2019, you could see Norway's share was massive. It was up there around 50%, whereas most European countries were struggling to hit 5% electric vehicle share of car sales. So it had a massively higher market share. Compared to the global average, it was about 20 times higher at that point. So these tipping points are very useful. And this, just to emphasize, this is why I say I'm very much in favor of carbon pricing, especially taxes, because it can do this kind of thing. It's worth saying these kind of effects are likely to come towards the middle of the transition. It's very hard at the beginning to get this. You have to do some other things first. I'll come on to that in a second. Then on this question of level, well, what do you want the level to be in different parts of the economy? If you have just one level, it might be enough to cross the tipping point in one sector, but it might be less than you need in others, and it might be far more than you need in others. So actually, you want your carbon tax to be sector specific. You want it to be enough to cross the tipping point in each sector if you're going to use it. A quick word about strategy. Of course, I've talked about policy levers individually so that we can think about the role of each one. But of course, a transition is a complicated thing, and you move through it over time. Different things work at different times. What happens if you focus on achieving least cost emissions reduction at each moment in time? That's what an emissions trading scheme is designed very carefully to do. Well, actually, it's almost the worst possible strategy. It means you're leaving the difficult things for as long as you possibly can. You're doing a load of easy things meanwhile, while you delay those difficult things. So first you do nothing. You can probably just, absorb a bit of extra cost. Then you increase the efficiency of fossil fuel systems. Then when you can't do that anymore and you're still trying to reduce emissions, you start burning biomass. And then you get to a point where none of those things work. And at that point, you have nowhere else to go. You don't have anything else that you can use instead. Where's your clean technology? Well, you haven't spent any time developing it. You haven't created the industries for it, the supply chains, the skills. The technology itself, if it even exists, is still too expensive. So then your choices are really bad. You can bust your carbon budgets, close down your industry, relocate it overseas, or you can just reject addressing climate change at all and vote in a government that won't do it. That's not a great set of options. So what's the opposite strategy? Well, it's don't actually focus on the emissions. Focus on the zero emission solutions. Those have to get to 100% of the market. They're only going to get to 100% if you build them up. So think about the process of building them up. And it goes through this typical sequence of first the research, the development, the demonstration, then these market introduction policies like public procurement and targeted subsidies. They get it established in the market first. Then maybe you can use some regulations like a zero emission vehicle mandate, similar things in other sectors to spread it more quickly through the sector. Then you get into the deeper redesign of the markets and the surrounding infrastructure, maybe trade agreements and the social consequences and so on. If you've done all of those things, then towards the end of the transition, you should be able to ban the old technology without anybody caring and perhaps even without anybody noticing. That will be the mark of success. So it frustrates me when there are great campaigns, as there are so much of the time and always around COP, of phase out the fossil fuels. But yeah, that's what we're trying to do. But we don't do it just by going to some oil well and trying to put a lid on it. That's not how we're going to do it. We're going to phase them out by building up the clean stuff. First build, then break. When we get there, they won't have a leg to stand on. I realize I'm still taking a lot of our time, and I want a quick time check. We aiming for about 15 minutes conversation, there or thereabouts.
Yes, there or thereabouts, but I'm enjoying this, so keep going.
Thanks. All right, yeah. Well, I'm going to speed up through diplomacy for the sake of preserving time for conversation. Um, if we're in the equilibrium economy, the more you want to reduce emissions, the more expensive it's going to be. So it's a bit of a task of Sisyphus, and it's a negative sum game. Burden sharing, let's argue over our carbon space. How do we divide up the global carbon budget? But actually, if you've got these feedbacks and you can have clean technologies that are cheaper and better than fossil fuels, then in fact, according to the best available analysis, there are probably trillions of savings globally within the next few decades of moving to a clean economy. That's what the best evidence now is showing. That means we could be in the world of a positive sum game for climate change diplomacy. So how do we reframe the whole thing? Well, instead of arguing about emissions targets and how to divide up the remaining global carbon budget, that negative sum game, we should instead focus on the S-curve of the transition. How do we work together to get up that S-curve more quickly in each of the emitting sectors? That's a positive sum game because you have these gains from coordination. If we align our actions, we can get faster innovation, larger economies of scale, level playing fields where they're needed. But to achieve that, there are three ways that we have to restructure climate change diplomacy. The first is it can't be economy-wide. It has to be sector-specific. That's because each one of these are different. As the IPCC said, we need system transitions in each of these emitting sectors. Each one is a different system. Shipping is not the same as buildings. Steel isn't the same as agriculture. Each one of these has a different political economy. It has different influential countries. It has different problems to solve, it has different solutions, and it has a different nature of international connections. The power sector is, in some countries, a very nationally bounded thing, whereas the steel sector, for example, is not. It's a global sector with a lot of trade. So it has to be sector specific. Second is participation. You do not want 196 parties around the table trying to agree everything. You do not want Saudi Arabia having veto power over every single thing you're trying to do. And so instead of all countries in the world, I mean, that's great for consensus, agreeing global goals, but we've done that already. We now need practical action and solutions. For that, you can get away with far fewer. In most of the emitting sectors, the top 10 countries account for about 80% of global production or consumption. Cars is one example. You get to over 3/4 of the global car market with having 10 countries. Canada's one of them. And actually, just 3 regulators they write the rules for over half the global car market. Those are the people in Brussels, Beijing, and Washington. And if Washington's ruled by somebody stupid, you can replace that with California, and it's still true. You're still writing the rules for over half the global car market. And we did this study, this piece of modeling a few years ago. It's probably a bit out of date now, but at that time we showed aligning regulations, ZEV mandate type regulations between those three big economies could bring forward the electric vehicle tipping point by about 5 years. More recently, I did the same study again for trucks. Trucks are much earlier in the transition, big, heavy road transport, not nearly as many electric vehicles on the road as we're now getting with cars. And when we started this study, we were looking at US, China, and Europe. Halfway along, for some reason, we decided to change that to China, Europe, Canada, half of the US, and India, that half being the half that follows California in its vehicle regulations. Uh, and we found that small group working together, aligning their regulations in line with the commitments of the Global Memorandum of Understanding on medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicles, they could bring forward the trucks tipping point by about 3 years, which is very much worth having. So that was participation. You don't need that many countries, you just need the right ones working together. Final point is about timescale. So often climate change diplomacy is focused on long-term targets. What are your emissions targets for 2030? Let's argue about that. What about 2050? And so on. But maybe that's not a good point of leverage. Maybe we should focus on the present. Why is the future not a good source of leverage? Well, you're uncertain. Governments don't know what they can achieve in future, so they tend to be cautious. Not only that, there's an even stronger reason. Early in the transition, by definition, interests are not strongly aligned with the transition. Most people don't want it to happen. By definition, the sector is full of these companies that are doing well with the incumbent technologies, so they don't want to change. But as you go through the transition, the interests change. And my example of that, China with solar PV. The first target it set in 2008 for deploying solar power in China was 1.8 gigawatts by 2020. When it got to 2020, they deployed 253 gigawatts, 140 times as much. Why did that happen? Interest change. One of those changing interests was as the technology cost came down, which was a result of that early deployment, suddenly there was a new interest. Use solar in China to generate cheap electricity. The other thing that happened was these industries started selling solar panels to Europe and America, making profits. They wanted more of that. They wanted bigger markets. That increased the interest in deploying it in China as well. So if you focus on doing the right things now, you activate these positive feedbacks and you make bigger things possible in future. If you just focus on those long-term targets, you don't necessarily get that effect and you just waste a lot of breath. So in summary, on climate change diplomacy, for the last 30 years, we've been focused on the point of least leverage in my slightly awkwardly drawn 3D space. We've been focused on this point of long-term targets, whole economy scope, and maximum participation, all the countries in the world around the table. No wonder we've ended up with a process that is entirely devoid of substance. Substance is now completely left to countries to choose for themselves unilaterally. It's actually unilateralism masquerading as multilateralism. And we need to shift to the opposite point in this 3D space, the point of maximum leverage for climate diplomacy, which is small groups of countries working on specific sectors focused on the actions that need to be taken now. And if we do that, then there is a hopeful note that I often like to end on, which is there are these positive tipping points in many of the big emitting sectors of the economy where the clean technologies can outcompete the fossil fuels. And wonderfully, these different sectors of the economy are connected to each other by shared technologies. And so each positive tipping point that we cross also increases the chances of crossing other positive tipping points in the economy. And that may just about give us a chance of reducing global emissions 5 times faster and avoiding the most dangerous forms of climate change. I'm going to finish on this point, even though I had more, but I've gone slowly through these bits. Maybe in conversation, we might say a few words about steel, which is an incredibly important sector very, very early in its transition. Canada is one of the important countries in that sector, and all I'm going to do is just show you uh, a page where, if you're interested in steel, you can have a look at our report, Making Clean Steel Competitive in International Trade. But I won't talk about it now. I'll just save that so that we can have a conversation. Thanks.
Well, I think I speak for all of us when I say that was incredible. Thank you so much. That was so informative. So we have, yes, as you can see, lots of applause coming, and many people commented in the chat how excited they were to hear from you. So that was such an informative presentation. We have several questions that people have submitted when they registered. So let's take a look at some of those. Okay, can you see a question on the screen? Could you share your perspective? All right, perfect. So, could you share your perspective on the idea that we're losing ground in the fight against climate change? And this comes from Jerry in Calgary, Alberta.
Thanks, Jerry. In many ways, I agree, but uh, it's just two different halves of this. If we look at what's happening in the climate itself and in the Earth system, then I absolutely worry that we're losing ground. Of course, we took too long to get started. We're still not acting as strongly as we ought to be. And it looks, if you look at how has the scientists' understanding changed over time, uh, they've tended to keep reassessing in the direction of understanding the risks to be larger for a given degree of warming. And that, I think, is partly because some of the reinforcing feedbacks in the Earth system were quite hard to anticipate, to know how many there would be and how strong there would be. And so I think we're in enormous danger in that respect. However, on the other side, if you look at what's happening in the economy, I know it might not always feel like it, but I think we're gaining ground. I think we're winning. The clean technologies are expanding very, very rapidly. The fossil fuels are not. I think the IEA reported that during the course of last year, investment globally in clean technologies was double global investment in fossil fuels. You could not have said that a few years ago. That's an enormous turnaround compared to where we were when, for example, James Hansen was writing the book that I was sharing earlier. So there, in some ways, in some ways we're gaining ground.
Wonderful. And yeah, one thing you have pointed out is you've shown us in several ways how progress so often doesn't look linear, which is reassuring. Okay, so a question we have from Annika in Ottawa is who is listening? And more specifically, are you able to divulge if you've ever been consulted by federal, provincial, or territorial governments in Canada?
Yes, a nice question. Who's listening? Hopefully some people right now. Uh, some
I
nice
think
people
everyone
have
here
written
is
nice things
listening.
in the chat. Yeah, no, it's a great question. I do my best to be listened to, and uh, I wonder how's best to answer that. I think globally there is gradually a shift in understanding. There is a greater understanding that if you want these clean technologies to be deployed, uh, then you need to support their deployment. And, which may sound really obvious, uh, but it's still a battle of ideas. And cap and trade schemes are still being developed by China, by India, by Brazil. They're still being relied on by the European Union, despite having been pretty unsuccessful for the last 20 years. So there's still a battle of ideas. And I'm taking part in that battle as vigorously as I can. Um, the answer to the second part of the question is no, I've never been consulted by the Canadian government at any level. But when I used to work for the British government, then we did tend to have good cooperation with the Canadian government. They were a good ally.
Wonderful. All right. And then we have a question from Angela in Toronto, Ontario. She asked, in your opinion, how does nuclear energy fit into transitioning 5 times faster?
So I want to be clear, I don't have an ideological position on nuclear. I'm not in principle for it or against it. Um, but I'm pretty skeptical about it because it's one of the few energy technologies where if you look at it globally, the data suggests the costs have gone up over time, not down. Why would they go up? Well, because we get stricter about the safety requirements that we want from it over time. Uh, so that's in stark contrast to solar and wind and batteries that have all gone very, very steeply downward in cost over time. So I know people talk about small modular reactors, but I suspect that's a very effective lobbying strategy from the nuclear companies. I have quite a lot of skepticism that it's really going to be able to compete when the family of clean technologies around renewables is just getting better and better all the time.
Well, thank you for sharing your perspective on that. And Citizens Climate Lobby Canada similarly doesn't officially have a position for or against nuclear. We do have concerns about the price as well. So we have a question. Well, Carol in Etobicoke, Ontario, and Kathy in Calgary, Alberta asked similar questions. So they want to know, how can constituent volunteers apply some of the concepts you've shared, and what sectors in Canada should we focus on where we can make a difference?
Thanks for that question. I'm going to make one suggestion because I know we're not long on time, but I mentioned steel. Why do I have a bee in my bonnet about steel? Well, about 20% of global emissions come from energy intensive industries. And roughly speaking, we've made hardly any progress at all in nearly all of those. That might be a bit harsh. There's been development of technologies, but there hasn't yet been deployment. Uh, Last year, the IEA estimated that 0.1% of steel production globally was produced through near zero emission technologies. So we've got it all to do. Contrast that with a fifth of car sales, maybe even a quarter now globally being electric vehicles, or about 90% of power capacity additions globally being renewables. Those are the sectors where we're doing well. We're going far ahead. We're doing uselessly badly in the energy intensive industries. Now, those are things like steel, cement, chemicals, and a bunch of others. Steel is probably the one of those that can go first. And if we get it right on steel, the others will see how they need to follow. So what do we do on steel? I want to suggest one thing, and I think it's quite close to the kind of stuff that you lobby for already. It's almost like a fee and dividend. The only difference is uh, which of those do you do first? You could say instead of fee and dividend, it's dividend and fee. I actually call it subsidy and recharge. What it is, it's a subsidy for clean steel production that allows you to produce clean steel at the same cost as steel from a blast furnace with the high emissions. So first you allocate that subsidy, then you take whatever the cost of all of those subsidies and you recharge it back to the industry itself. You spread it equally per ton of steel produced. You apply it to imports as well as domestic production, and you have an exemption for exports. What that does is gives you three things as well as deploying clean steel. It's revenue neutral for governments. It creates no competitiveness risks at all for the industry, and it's trivial cost to consumers. If you're buying a car or a washing machine or a spade, uh, that steel decarbonisation will only add a fraction of a percent to the cost of the thing that you're buying. So clean steel subsidy and recharge. It's explained in a lot more detail in the report that I shared a link to at the end. I'll just mention the link again. It's scurveeconomics.org. There's no punctuation in that apart from the dot. You can find the report there, making clean steel competitive in international trade. And I know Canada's a pretty significant steel producer. It's one of the ones that's up there in a group of fewer than 10 that together can make up about 80% of global steel production. And when I say there's 10, that's not the 10 biggest steel producing countries. I'm ruling out ones like the USA and Russia that are ruled by people who are trying to make this problem harder. So it's 10 big but also sensible countries. So
Oh, that's
please
really
lobby
a
for
wealth
that.
of information. Okay, I was excited to hear what you were going to have to say when you mentioned steel. It did not disappoint. Thank you. So, Kathy, is that the time we have?
We started about 3 minutes late because of technical issues. Is it okay with everyone if we go to one more question and then do announcements after? Is that okay with you, Simon, if we go a tiny bit over? It's not
Yeah, of course.
it's not the usual CCL way, but we had that really interesting technical glitch. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate that. And we know it's getting late where you are, so we do appreciate you taking the time to be with us at a time when we're awake. Okay, so we have a question about gas. So Michael in Edmonton, Alberta asked, "What is the most effective way to get the messaging across about decarbonizing gas lines to buildings?" Or if you want to answer just one part of that question, either talk about gas lines or messaging, that's fine too.
I'll tell you what, let me, if I can, say something briefly on that question, and then also just address one of the questions in the chat, because I happen to see one there that I think is a useful one to. I mean, they're all are, but one I'd like to pick up and a good one to end on. So I just say I don't do a lot of work on buildings decarbonization. It's something where in the UK we got stuck for an awful long time because it was difficult, and the government couldn't decide, should we go for heat pumps or should we go for hydrogen as a heating fuel in the UK? I don't know about Canada, but we have a massive gas network. Right now my room that I'm sitting is being warmed by a radiator with water in it that's being heated by gas being burned downstairs at my house. And also my house is incredibly inefficient. So in all of those ways, it's typical for a house in the UK. And the government did nothing for ages because it couldn't decide about the technologies. Finally, it's figured out that hydrogen for heating doesn't really make sense. Heat pumps are going to be a lot more efficient. And that's probably the main thing that we need to do. Install a load of heat pumps. And we need regulation that does that, that says, if you build a new house, then it needs to have heat pumps and it needs to be insulated so that they work well. We also need, in fact, we're developing in the UK a regulation that works a lot like a zero emission vehicle mandate, but it's applied to the suppliers of gas boilers. So it says X% of your sales should be heat pumps instead of gas boilers, and that's rising over time. So that has the effect I was talking about of shifting shifting finance in that sector of the economy and hopefully pushing more innovation and cost reduction. Heat pumps don't have such a great cost curve as solar does, but you still see in the countries where they've deployed far more of them, like in the Northern European, Denmark, Sweden, places like that, the prices of them are much lower than in the UK, where we've done a really bad job. So, um, if I can finally pick up, there's a question in this chat from Scott Hunt, who said, "Fact check, please. My understanding of the history of solar is that Germany introduced policies that made solar incredibly attractive for consumers. People made money from their solar generated power. This upped the demand for solar significantly, which caused the investment in solar panels, which drove the cost down, leading to solar becoming the cheapest energy now. I believe this is a practical example of what you're talking about. If this is correct, how do we make it happen again for other clean energies?" So thanks, Scott. Yes, absolutely. That is exactly what I'm talking about. That's this mega feedback, amplifying feedback between investment, innovation, cost reduction, and demand. And policy was there making it happen, the feed-in tariffs, as you say. But the thing I want to highlight, just mentioning another great book, if people like reading books on this kind of thing, there's a book by a guy called Greg Nemeth, and it's called How Solar Energy Became Cheap. And he talks about it in the big, long time scale. From earliest of all, it was the US government subsidizing the use of research and development of solar panels, solar PV technology, first of all, in labs for different purposes. They weren't quite sure what it was going to be, but as I said, it was used on satellites very early on. Then the US government early on also had bulk public procurement program. I think it was the Jimmy Carter government, and they had some deployment subsidies. And later on, when Reagan or Nixon or whoever it was canceled all of those programs, the Japanese were the next ones to take up the baton. The Japanese had some policies driven by their interest in energy security. They were freaked out by the fossil fuel price spike of the late 1970s. And then after the Japanese had a political change and lost the will, then the Germans picked it up. Then the Germans had these feed-in tariffs help create a huge market. Then after them, it was the Chinese. The Chinese had responded to the German market, but then all those changes in China happened, and they thought they were onto a good thing, and they built their own domestic market and deployed it at even greater scale, and the cost came down even more, and so on. So the reason why I'm telling this story is that I think it's a really optimistic way of thinking about these transitions, that all over the world, different people are going to pick up the baton. And when you run into difficulties in your country, never mind, because the stuff that you've done that's helped push something down the cost curve will help somebody else somewhere else pick it up and push it on further. So that's what we have to do. We're all part of this community and this joint effort together. And if you identify any sector where you think in Canada there's a decent chance of the right focused policy to reallocate resources through targeted subsidies or investment or regulations to the new zero emission technologies, push them down the cost curve in a way that hasn't been done yet globally, that will be a massive, massive lasting contribution. So I'll end on that point.
Well, that's a very empowering call to action. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, sharing your knowledge, your extensive research, and again, I think it's clear from the conversation in the chat that everyone really enjoyed this, and we're also appreciative. So let's have one more round of applause for our speaker.
And can we have your slides? Is
Yeah,
is it okay? Okay, I'll ask.
yeah, absolutely.
I'll ask for them in an email. Thank you so much, Simon. Everyone stay around. We have we have a few announcements that Mary Blake's going to make. You did not disappoint, and thank you, Mary Blake. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. I love your picture there, by the way. Yeah, wish you all good luck with all the campaigning.
Thank you so much. All right, so we have a few announcements. First of all, 2026 is already off to a good start. As many of you may know, but some may not know, we have a letter to the editor writing session every Wednesday evening. And last Wednesday we were 4 for 4. I got a letter published. Kathy Page in Calgary got a letter published. Andy Kubrin in Calgary also got a letter published. And Liz Addison in Toronto got a letter published. And Cheryl McNamara in Toronto got a letter in the Globe and Mail this morning. So that is very exciting. If you're wearing your good glasses, you might be able to see them here. And we already have some very successful lobbying efforts underway. Kathy and Tracy in Calgary had a meeting with Tracy's MP, and our national capital group had a meeting with MP Yasser Naqvi. And yesterday, Emma in Vancouver met with a staff member from Premier Ebby's office, the Premier of British Columbia. Lots to celebrate already in 2026. Kathy, did I forget something?
No, you got it all. And there's lots more to announce, but we'll leave it at that. You guys are rocking it.
Our next education call will be Thursday, February 19th. It will be Leslie Shiel, and you can see the times in various time zones on the screen. It'll be in the evening for most of us. So put that in your calendar. And then in March, we're looking ahead to Philip Newell. And as I mentioned, we have weekly letter writing sessions that anyone is welcome to join. That happens every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. And then starting next week, Wednesdays, we have the Climate Leader Launchpad at 5 p.m. Pacific or 8 p.m. Eastern. That's an informational call for new or newish volunteers. And if you are interested in lobbying with us in Ottawa, then circle June 1st through 3rd on your calendar. And if you want to take action right now, we have an open letter that is currently open for signatures. It is in favor of Bill S-238, the Climate Aligned Finance Act, which is currently in the Senate. If you came to our last informational call in December, you would have heard from Senator Rosa Galvez, who introduced the legislation. And if you would like to sign that letter, there is a link in the chat that you can follow. We are currently at 182 signatures, so very happy about that. In case you like friendly competition, currently Toronto is in the lead with 48 signatures, and Calgary is right behind with 29 signatures. But we're happy for any and all signatures in support of CAFA.
Yeah, and the number one way that people are signing is through personal asks, being personally asked. That's the number one way. So thank you for all those personal asks out there.
And I think that's it for announcements. Kathy, did you have anything to add?
No, we'll stop recording, and wonderful job, Mary Blake, and thanks everyone for being here.